Thanks everybody for joining. Um, I have nothing to do during quarantine since I can't work, so I appreciate having a thing to spend time on right now. Um, what I'll want to talk about today is just kind of how I see zone defense in a design and implementation way. I'm not going to get extremely specific into tactically formations or different strategies at a very 2-3-2 versus 3-3-1 kind of level. I more lean towards that kind of the way that you play a zone is more important than the shape of the zone itself. So the way you communicate with each other and let your own team's individual talents shine, I think is a lot more, is going to have more of an impact than the specific shape of the zone, which also changes shape during the play. I also don't really want to give all the tactical sockeye zone stuff out just anywhere, so that's also part of why. But yeah, so my quick history is I've been coaching since 2012. I coached Pitmen for 6 years, Temper for 2, AUDL Thunderbirds for 3, and I just finished my second year with sockeye. And this is kind of the first year that I've had a zone that I felt extraordinarily confident in. So it's kind of good timing of being able to talk about this. And it was very, very, very effective. I think we played at 9 points in bracket play of nationals and got turns on 5 of them, and a couple of them being in pretty calm conditions. So I feel qualified in that regard to speak about this specific topic. So the way I want to break up the talk is into 3 different sections. First, the kind of preseason phase of a zone, which is where you think about what your team is, think about what your team needs, and make those pre-practice decisions of what your zone is going to be. And then second part of the talk is going to be how you teach it, good ways to practice it, and then third talk is how you implement it in a game. And then between each section, or after each section, I'll give time to type any questions you have in the chat, and then I'll answer those in between those so it can break it up. And at the very end, I'll have I don't have anything else to do, so I can stay around for a while and answer questions. Most of my coaching experience is as a men's coach for teams contending for a national championship. So that's going to kind of color the way I see and communicate things. I'm going to do my best to keep it very general. So any lesson I have is for hopefully anybody, but just know if that might be a direction I slip in, whether I want to or not. Okay. So first, when you're going to create a zone in the preseason, you need to answer the question of why do you want to play zone defense? I'm going to start with the obvious one because it's a defense that you think can get blocks. I think that's extremely important, obviously, and I don't necessarily think there's a ton of value in a defense that is only to throw a curveball that then might get you a block a point or two down the road. So I think first and foremost, you should be approaching your zone with the idea of this will get us blocks at a higher rate than our person defense. But, I'm not going to completely just get rid of the thought that changes of pace are important. That's a really good reason to do it. You may want to have a way to deal with some maybe speedier offenses that really don't want to have a pace of play at a much slower clip. So having that ability to shove them out of what their comfort zone is really important. Other reasons I could think of why you'd want to have a zone. Maybe your person defense just isn't quite up to snuff against maybe the teams that you need to beat, or you're a team that needs to steal a bid from another team ranked higher to get to nationals. And you think that's the best way to maybe bridge an athleticism gap. Another really good reason is maybe a specific rival struggles against a zone a good example I have, 2012 UW women actually created a zone just for playing against Oregon. And I think they used it for a couple of points at regionals just to test it out, and then fully broke it out at nationals, and that helped them win national championship because Oregon couldn't really deal with that. So maybe there is some opponent that's the hump you need to get over, and you can figure out, all right, we know their weakness, and we can design something based on how they play zone offense. A couple other reasons are your O-line needs practice against a zone defense. You may just run defenses in practice that you'll never run because you need your O-line to be practiced against those various styles. And that has a lot of value. We would run specific types of like vertical stack this past year, even though we're by and large a horizontal stack team, just because we knew our defense need to get reps against vert stack. And you can think that same way, where you want to prepare your team and know what their responses are against different styles, and giving them those in practice reps saves you maybe 3 or 4 points of an adjustment period during a game. And then lastly, the way that I think is the most fun, it gives you a way to highlight a uniquely talented player. When maybe in normal person defense, it's everyone's got a roughly 1/7 of their responsibility. Maybe you have a player who's just like a phenomenal mark, or an extremely good athlete, like I think in the men's division, like Jeff Babbitt and Von Allen Gielan are both top-notch hammers who can cover a disproportionate amount of the field, and giving them that context to fully show their strengths and design a defense around that, pushing in a way that like helps those players have an outsized impact, can be a really good way to optimize the way that you play defense, especially if you feel that need of, we're trying to find a way to bridge a gap between ourselves and a better team. And that can kind of also shrink some of the deficiencies, or maybe you have players that are not as well-rounded and they can be exploited in a normal person defense kind of game. So those are just the things that came to mind. Those are all a lot of things that you're going to like play around in your head, but I think what's important is you go in and you understand, all right, this is the reason that we're doing zone. And as you carry forth the implementation, then you have that guidance to always kind of be set against, and keep going in that direction. Another kind of way to think about all that is also, how does it mesh with your team context and kind of culture? Maybe you want to think about how your decision to play zone more often than not as a D-line point meshes with what your O-line's needs are. Maybe you're using zone as a way to sneak on your top O players, but doing so in a way where they don't have to run a lot. And in that aspect, you can have a zone that puts them in a certain position, and then you have a way to ensure that their position runs less and thinks more, and then they can have that huge impact when you get a turnover. You can also use a zone just as a way to give your O-line more rest. If they're, we run horizontal stack, which is a lot of running for an offense, and we, want to make sure that when we play a zone defense, we're not playing it in a way that gets beat so quickly that then our O-line is back on the field after running really hard for a decently long point. Another way to look at it in your whole context is, what other things do you have maybe in your defensive arsenal that fit really well with it? You could have like a transition junk that you run to shut down pull plays for a few points, and you can think about having that zone play off of what that junk is, whether it looks like it or has a slight difference that just makes the offense question what they're seeing when it comes down. Like, is it the junk? Is it a zone? And maybe they try to beat it one way with a junk that won't work against that zone. So it's not like an isolated defense. You want it within the context of all your defensive strategies. And then also just think about culturally, how is your team's energy? I think about UNC Wilmington men who are just a bunch of chaotic, aggressive, unpredictable, loud humans, and they ran a trap zone where they would do a roller pull just really well out of bounds and just set this really loud sideline right next to the disc. Really chaotic pattern that we hadn't seen before that did a really good of flustering us, but also in the context of the way that they always fluster us. And I think there's a lot of value in understanding they can do that higher risk style that might get broken quicker and result in a goal quicker, but also has this moment of chaos and creates fear in the offense, which is kind of what they're doing the entire time. But if you're maybe a more level-headed team, you might just want to have something that's a little bit more conservative and passive and lets the play kind of tick away and just ensure that you don't get beat quickly and have things kind of on your level of mental energy. So yeah, that's a lot of like very vague things to think. And then the last thing I would say when you're designing your zone is what your personnel strengths are and allowing kind of drawing it up in a way that lets your players highlight what they're very good at and gives your zone a unique flavor. Like you should be running, if you're running a standard 4-person cup with 2 hammers and a deep and it's a trapping zone, ideally that should look different than it looks for other teams because you're allowing the field to shift a little bit towards what your players are good at doing, which is unique to what other teams do. I mentioned Von Allen-Gielen and Jeff Babbitt before, but they change the way the defense can play. Machine often traps the sideline away from Vaughn because that encourages the offense to try something really long and cross field to break that zone, which is now they're trying 25-yard bullets in their general vicinity of Vaughn, and that gives them a chance to be like an explosive block creator like he is. So maybe you have a really good explosive hammer like that, and you can shade the trap away from them to encourage the defense or the offense to try something floaty or really cross field that then lets that player do what they're best at doing. Maybe you have a really, really good mark and you want a trapping zone so you can have them use their skills the best. Maybe you have smarter and more instinctive handler defenders. So rather than having it be a trap zone, you have more moments of forced middle where those handler defenders can then match up on the center handler spontaneously and let their instincts take over. Or if you have an extremely, extremely fast deep, you can have that deep play very shallow and effectively almost give you another hammer stop while also still having the deep space covered because they're uncharacteristically fast. So those are the ways that I would say you want to think about and see what are individual things that are anomalies in a very good way. Like what players are the people that kind of change the rules of how you can play defense, and how can I best highlight that in the strategy that we want to present. And then just on the topic of create or designing, I also think it's really, really good to obviously watch film and find examples of teams where you just like their style. You know, again, I think that formation isn't as important as your the way that you play it and the way that you communicate it, but seeing teams that maybe it's the same style you've seen, but it's played in a way you haven't thought about before, or they're doing certain things that you couldn't have predicted, that's something you want to emulate. So the ones off the top of my head, Madison Radicals and AUDL are really, really good. In men's club, Machine and Ring of Fire are teams that have had pretty phenomenal zones the last few years. And then in the college level, same, speaking about Ring, the zone that Mike DeNardis created in like 2014-ish for UNC men is a really cool, very aggressive trapping zone where they essentially they always trap backhand. They'll drop one of the hammers almost into the handler space to create a big opening in the very far like from the trap sign to a cross field 30-yard hammer, but you're throwing it the wrong direction because you're right-handed and trapped on the backhand side. That's one I really like. Michigan zone around 2014, 2015 also I was really impressed with. And then Dig from this past season was really good. And they took it to us pretty good in pole play with their zone. And yeah, those are just the ones that come up off the top of my head as things that I've watched and taken principles from. But, you know, your specific division may be different. You might have other things, but in general, just watch a lot of film and see what you like. I think playing a style that you enjoy and have fun with is not only important, but it's going to make it a lot easier for you to actually play it successfully. So yeah, that's it for kind of the part one of things to think about when you design. If you have any questions in chat, I'll get to those now, and then we can move to implementation next. So I'll give a couple minutes, and if nothing, then I'll keep moving on. All right, I'll go to the next section then. So next is, wait, we do have something. Cool.
Sorry, Hogan. Yeah, I just submitted.
You're good. You're good.
I can do it over voice.
Yeah, so I will get to wind Willig, but yes, I had that more as when you're implementing in a game, but I'll get to that in the third section. And then the names of the zones that I liked, I like, and these are all men's division because that's where I compete and in the film that I watch. Madison Radicals for an AUDL zone where you can double team, Machine and Ring of Fire in the club division, and like 2015 UNC in Michigan in college, and then this past year 2019 Dig. From regionals, Dig has a lot of footage of that, so you can watch, I think, a couple games against Pony where they were really effective with it. Thank you, Christie, for typing that. That rocks. Yeah, Willig, the reason I don't have weather right now is that's a little bit less predictable to kind of anticipate what specific weather conditions you might face, unless you are coaching in the North Central region for college, and then you know it's going to be an absolute slot fest, and you can kind of know that's it going in. Yeah, if I'll give another minute for any questions, and if not, I'll move forward. All right, sweet. So talking about now implementing in practice. So hopefully at this point you have a very broad, kind of amorphous blob of ideas about what you want to create and the directions you want to go with them. What I think is really important with when you implement that is having flexibility and being willing to adjust on the fly at practice if you see that the way that your zone is effective is different than what you might expect it to be beforehand. But when you're teaching a zone, you want to start with the scenarios that it's very easy for that zone to maintain shape and structure. So usually that's a dead disc on the sideline, and just giving your defense the opportunity to get used to where they're on the field, how the offense might attack them, and getting used to communicating with the people in their position and maybe the position next to them. So you can have that kind of talk between like wings and handler defenders. What you don't want to do is be in that phase for very long. What I think the first skill you need your zone to be able to pick up is the ability to not get shredded. So the ability to play a zone point where it takes a lot of throws for the offense to score, and you can have a goal number, you can have a time number, but just ensuring that by doing that, you allow your defense to get more and more reps of throws and more reps communicating with one another and more reps changing their shape when the disc moves. So that's the first place I would start, is kind of implementing it in a really conservative way where you're not having these much quicker possessions that then you're not even getting quality repetitions during that practice itself. Then I would say, then after you get to the point where you're able to be on the field for a while without getting scored on, and you can tell the offense has to work and has to start make decisions and think about things and swing and move it without getting anything from it. Then the next skill that you want to be able to add is that you can move the offense where you want them to be. And this goes back a little bit to what you have in mind. Where do you want to get blocks? Where do you think the offense is at its worst spot against your defense? And does your team have the ability to move them in the direction that you want them to go? And for different teams, that might come in different ways. But yeah, so, oh yeah, and then with that kind of thought, I also would encourage to give the players time to workshop things. The first practice especially, there's going to be a lot of mutual discovery and exploration of how these positions work, and there's a lot of communication. But I've found it effective to, at some point, identify what the issue is. That, all right, we're not containing the offense's lateral motion at all. We need to figure out how we do that and present that to the players and let them talk to each other and meet, like the mark and the two handler defenders talk to each other, or the two hammers and the deep talk to each other, whatever it is. Just give them time to kind of come up with their own solution, rather than just knowing what the problem and the solution is. They might come up with something that is better than what you would have thought about to begin with. So I think that's like a really good phase that I've normally noticed. I'll be right back. Roommates doing yard work. Okay, so that is the spot where I found it most effective to let players kind of meet and talk with one another, is when you're trying to work on that ability to force the offense into a certain area. And then the final step is refining and figuring out where the best opportunities to get blocks are. And that could be in a different spot than you expected going into it, which is definitely what happened with us this past season. The areas where you're most able to get blocks consistently was not at all what we expected when we started. And that kind of had us on the fly have some positions we thought would be more aggressive to be more conservative and containing, and vice versa. So eventually you want to get that sense of not even where the blocks are coming from, but just where does it look like we're close to getting blocks, or if that player anticipated a beat quicker, we had a chance for that, and see what evolves naturally, and then have those be kind of the pride points that you rally around. And then this could also play into your personnel. So as these moments go by and you've figured out, all right, we're not getting shredded now, we are moving the offense where we want to go, now we know where we want to get blocks, some positions might arise as the ones that need to be more containing and conservative, and you put your smarter players that have more experience and can think a few throws ahead in those spots, and then other spots come to be the ones where we keep getting opportunities to get blocks here. Let's put our best athletes here, or whatever that might call for. That's kind of the process I would say to go through. And then to like slightly rewind, the way that you want to teach, I talked about starting from scenarios where it's very, very easy for the defense, like a dead disc on the sideline. You don't just have to do a straight through scrimmage. Whistle scrimmages are really good, or whistle startups, where you can blow a whistle once the zone is beat, and then you have an option to either rewind it a throw or two, and try to have your defense prevent what that thing that occurred was. Or you can blow the whistle, have them stop, just give the defense maybe a couple seconds to readjust to where the disc is, and then work on continuing to contain the offense. But I like the rewinding one a lot because it teaches the ability to think a few steps ahead and allow players to know, well, if I'm pinching on the swing, but I don't get it, then we're really screwed. But if I just let the swing go, worry about the throw 2 or 3 throws in advance, then they haven't gained any yardage from us. Feeling that as an actual example is really helpful to let players be able to think more stages in advance. And then for teaching, let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, really important for teaching zone. Your entire team will not be able to play zone defense at the level you need them to play it at. Just it's not going to happen. And I really wanted it to happen this season, but it didn't. And we essentially had our 8 zone starters. We didn't want to have any O-line players on our defense or on our zone defense. So we had our 8 starters. We kind of just had 1 surplus player. And then we had 1 substitute for each position. So in case an injury happened, we would still be fine. And a lot of those players were really experienced and able to play multiple positions. So we probably came to have around 10 or 11 just D-line players that were able to play it at the highest level we needed them to. That also leaves a chunk of your team with nothing to do. And part of the learning and teaching process is you should be winnowing down the players that you want to play zone. Maybe you start the first practice with all your D players getting an opportunity, but that list should be being narrowed down. But then you have this chunk of D players that don't have anything to do at practice. It's a really good opportunity to actually have them go and be a second O-line. There are a few reasons I really like that. One, it gives those players something to do. Often those might be the people at the bottom of your roster, and it feels really crappy to not do anything for maybe half an hour to an hour in practice. You want them to feel involved and like they have a role, and you can have them just go and be a second O-line and get some reps. This also, another way it helps them is they can kind of just do whatever they want. Again, if these are like more bottom of the roster players, a lot of them have to deal with the pressure of needing to restrain themselves or accept that they have a lesser role and not be able to take as many risks. But in a zone practice, you can just unleash them and encourage them to throw blades and scoobers and weird things and just not care if they turn it over as much. This also allows your zone defense to then play against another offensive style, because you want your O-line to be playing the way they need to be beating a zone, but giving another look to that same defense will help them further workshop during the practice rather than having to predict it. So yeah, that's what I'd encourage is narrow down quickly, but still give those people a thing to do and let them play some zone offense as well. So yeah, now I've got common errors that I see when you're teaching zone, and I think these are just things that have popped up for me a lot and something to watch out for. Number 1 is players spending most of their time watching the disc instead of watching the players that need to be defending, and that goes hand in hand with the concept of people guarding a zone instead of a player in the zone. And there is some give and take with this, and this might be more of a stylistic concern, but I think the best zone defenders are, and the zone defenses teams I've had the most struggle against, those teams that have the players scanning the field, seeing the players coming into their space, directly actually picking them up and guarding them while they're in their space, and then passing them off to a player when they leave their space. They're communicative with one another, they see the play better, and then if a player makes a play at something and gets exposed, it's a lot easier to support and cover up for them, and not have that risk that you took end up being a goal because you didn't have any support. So to sum that whole thing up, watch players and see what they're doing. Staring at the disc doesn't help you a whole lot, except maybe if you're in the wall or in the cup. Yeah, I've thought that Dig from 2019 and Michigan it was whenever they beat us and won Easterns. I think it might have been 2015. But those are two teams that do a really good job of picking up the first option that comes into their space. So the offense thinks they have something, then they don't, then they need another player to come in. And I've seen so many offenses that assume that zone defender is just staying in their spot and guarding that area rather than guarding the players in it. So you can, again, watch the Dig Pony footage from this last regionals. Dig gets a couple of turns because Pony doesn't think that Dig player is going to run with them through the zone. They think they're just standing there. So that's really, really good principle of making sure your players are doing that. I mentioned it before. Another error I see a lot in zone practice is when you get overly aggressive when the disc is moving laterally, like collapsing on a swing. So you might have one smaller swing coming up and a player who has 0.0000% chance of getting that disc is still diving in to move towards cutting it off. And then they're exposed further down the field for maybe a larger swing for a gain or something just up the gut. So having those players who are a little bit more patient and understanding that you don't need to bite on this, you just need to worry about the next thing. That's a really important thing to make sure is consistent with your zone. Another kind of specific tactical thing, and I don't know why I've seen this so many times, but this is in your very standard trapping zone with a mark and a 3-person cup and 2 hammers and a deep. If you're on that trapping sideline, you have your mark responsible for the no around. I've seen so many of those players that are responsible for that inside lane just be like 20 yards away for I don't know what reason. And rather than taking away the inside lane, they're actually giving 2 direct lanes to throw through, and they're not in concert with the rest of the cup. So that's just something I've seen pop up all the time, and it drives me pretty wild a lot. And I don't know why that keeps being passed down that direction. And then one other common error that I see teaching zone is, sorry, I got 2 more. One more is, one of them is, and I think teams are probably better understanding of this now and don't do it as much, but especially Madison does this and Machine does this where they stay in the zone the entire length of the field. I think that's really, really good. It collapses the field. It makes you not have to be afraid of the deep space anymore. You can actually play a tougher zone in that area. So I think it's a mistake to call out of zone just because a team got to midfield or just because they beat you. If you're able to recover and maintain your shape, I think playing that zone until they score or until you get a turnover is a great call. Machine had a good point against us in finals. It was a second half zone point that we scored upwind, but that might have been like a 4-minute point. And many of those minutes were within 10 or 15 yards of the end zone. And they just stayed in it. It was extremely difficult to find because it's just a much more condensed space. And then lastly, the thing that is a very holistic approach, and this depends more on what your level of opponent is, but I think it's a huge mistake to have a point where you don't have any moments of taking a risk, where you're just always conservative or always doing the kind of same thing you do throughout the length of the point. I think you need to have moments where you take the initiative in trying to make a play to get a block, and in doing it in a way that is unpredictable and hasn't been seen that point, but not necessarily something you need to call on the line, something that you empower your players to be able to figure out on the fly, and will often kind of fit with what we talked about before with personnel and the area you want the offense to go. If you watch Machine, Johnny Bansfield is a really, really good example of this, where he is on the mark trapping and he just lays out on a pump fake, and he keeps doing that because he is taking calculated risks to say, rather than putting 80% effort on the around throw, like I have every single throw this point, I'm going to go 120% on this throw, all or nothing, see what happens. And that makes it obviously really unpredictable for an offense to do anything, but it also, in a sense, it kind of respects, not trying to say this in like a morally superior way, but like it respects your opponent's ability more, where you understand that just playing it safe in the same way isn't going to work, or they might have a really good break thrower, and if I'm not going at any point to try to stop that overly or aggressively, they're just going to throw that around break every single time. They're always getting off the sideline. So finding those moments to put like kind of a slanted, like a more aggressive amount of risk, and teaching how to do that during a point and changing it is a really important aspect, I think. And it works with, again, having players that are watching other players instead of every player just like zooming in on the disc. That if you have your players watching the field, they can see a player makes a risk, and then they can cover for them if that doesn't work out. And that works a lot more holistically, where you're not going to get burned because your mark laid out on around backhand, because maybe it's going to work. So yeah, those are kind of the common errors that I have seen happen quite a bit. And yeah, I think those would be good to address during like the in practice implementation phase. Yeah, and that is it for kind of my thoughts on implementing in practice. I'll give another couple of minutes. People can add any questions they might have, and then I can move on to the last part. Okay, so from Michael, what do you consider a successful zone point for sockeye? I would say it is the three things I outlined before in what I want to see at practice. So step one is we do not get beat quickly. Step two is we move the offense where we want them. And step three is we get ourselves into spots where we can possibly take blocks, or where we can take risks to get blocks. So it's more about the pace the offense is running and the way we're able to control and dictate where they go on the field. And sometimes that will also look different for different opponents. But that's kind of it, where it's not as important if we get the block or not. It's just, are we in our correct shape? Are we all communicating well? And did we have a point where we had opportunities to get something? That means that we were playing it correctly. And sometimes we'll get those and sometimes we won't. Another way I would say is, a way to define a successful point is if you were playing up against a team that you know has a certain style of zone offense, if you were able to make them play a different style of zone offense they normally play, that's a really big win. Ring of Fire is a team that plays kind of a unique zone offense. We played 3 zone points against them in semifinals, and the first one they shredded us and gutted us the way that they do. But we also knew we had to get a point in of feeling the way that they played to be able to actually adjust to it on the field. And then we played 2 more points and got turnovers on both of those. So that first point, even though we got shredded, was still, in a sense, successful because it gave us a rep against what style they had, and it set us up to be able to play things properly. And then the other points were we made them play a style that they didn't want to play. They could no longer do the thing that they were doing before to beat us really, really quickly. So yeah, those are the many ways that would define success for us. How do you narrow down who gets to play Zone D, and how do you decide who is allowed to take risks in the zone? It depends on how well you know your team. We started out giving every player reps in practice to play. Quickly, it became clear that some people aren't at that capability. So, there's some thought in advance. It could be who played zone last year, or what players do we know have this ability, and where we think we can plug them. But it's also giving players the opportunity to show what they have. So I would say for sure, let everyone get a chance. But I wouldn't say any specific mistakes are deal breakers. Any mistake is a thing to teach and correct, and people might have different knowledge coming in and not know how that zone needs to be run anyways. So I wouldn't say anything's a deal breaker, but you have to be able to watch and see, all right, what's the weak point? Where are we getting beat? Does this player have this ability to anticipate or communicate or whatever it might be? That's just something you have to watch and see where the success is and where the failure is. And then the second part was who was allowed to take risks in the zone. Kind of the same thing. Part of it is who do you know on your team is already a block getter and or a unique talent, and let them go and do what they're capable of. And the other part is just where does the zone end up a lot? Where is the offense? What does that open up as an avenue to take a risk? If you're really, really good at getting a team on the sideline, that could be a really good chance to let your mark take over, or have a handler defender sneak in and match up on the A reset, something like that. Good drills to work on specific aspects or positions in the zone instead of full field scrimmaging. So I've done in the past things like, you might have 3v4 where you're just playing in a smaller space and there are 3 defenders and 4 offensive players, or vice versa. And that can kind of allow you to practice small space communication and what the cup and the wall are like. I think that's the main one that I would say has popped up as something I've found useful, but I, in general, haven't found drills that break it down into smaller components to be a better use of time than full field practice. I think there's just there are too many variables and too much communication in between positions of various depths that are extremely important, that I think those are the skills that are more important than how to stop crashes that much, although that can be an avenue where you go a little smaller. But I would honestly just say, I think the best way to do it is do full field 7-on-7, because there's just too much communication happening that when you strip that away, you're not going to have an end result where you can add up the little parts and have that remotely equal what the entirety of the thing is. Oh, Goldy, I miss you too, man. All right, so what do you think the prerequisites that need to be checked off before you even consider teaching zone? Communication skills, do you need to be a solid lockdown defender before you can be an effective zone defender? No, I don't think you need to be I think those are different skills. And even there are different styles of person defense that maybe don't translate very well with one another. You can play a more switchy poachy style and not be good at locking down and vice versa. So I would say it's the same as zone, where there aren't necessarily any skills you need, but it also depends on what your zone is and what needs you have. The thing that probably translates the most is the mark, where that is just an aspect that is more or less the same in both. But I mean, I think it's like really it's more subtle things. It's like communication and vision and anticipation that uh, I think are more important in the zone than that might not show themselves in being a lockdown defender, especially if you're just head down, focused on that one player. Um, so yeah, let me look at your question again because I know there was like more to it than just what I've said. So yeah, I wouldn't say they're prerequisites, depending on what level it is. I think those things of like communication and anticipation and flexibility are all things that are skills you should teach at most levels. Those need to be implemented, and waiting to unlock those until a certain point isn't entirely, I think, the way to go. But that comes back to the thought of how do you narrow down who your zone players are, and then you have a chunk of people that aren't learning these skills. I would probably encourage colleges to try to have more people playing zone because they're more developmental players and you have more practice time. Like we just don't have as much practice time in club. We're not year round, that we don't have the excess reps to have those players getting those reps. We just don't have the time for it. But yeah, I don't think there's things you need to unlock as long as there's like a baseline level of competency of playing. And sometimes that's the best way to learn it. Sometimes you'll learn things about communication and vision that then will help your person defense, because now you have these other skills that you've added that you didn't really understand are very important aspects of person defense already. So yeah, I hope that answered it, Goldy. I feel like it did, but I ramble a lot. Sweet. I will give another minute and then we can move on to implementing in games. Ooh, 8-minute warning. All right, Willig, sweet. So teaching it on the field. So Willig asked, at the club level where on-field time is limited, what have you found to be your best tool in teaching zone and not taking up too much practice time? You should devote a practice to it. I found that our first practice was a lot more teaching and our second was a little bit less, but letting those first couple give time to communicate, give time for people to problem solve, and play 7-on-7 as much as you can. And the most prep work you can do, the better. So the more film you have, the more tactical diagrams you have, whatever it takes, the better everyone is going into practice educated and informed about it already, the quicker everything's going to be. But I would say kind of like if it's something that you're going to value, I think you should treat it like it's going to be a very important defense for yourself. If it's not, I don't know if it's worth the time. If it's just going to be at the club level, if it's just a thing to do because you're doing it, or maybe you don't have the time to really get it nailed down, it's tough to say it's totally worth that investment. But you know, treat it like it's going to be a way that gets you blocks in really big moments, and kind of treat it with that intensity. And I think that would be kind of the way I would see that. All right, let's just move on to implementing in games. So hopefully you guys listened to Lauren's talk last week. Not that like it was a prerequisite, but it was really awesome and informative, and it kind of framed my mindset a lot. Ideally, you go into a game knowing what that team's zone offense style is, or at least who their personnel are, what their strengths are. You should have a goal of what your zone is attempting to do against this specific team. And you can also have the ability to make adjustments to what your zone would normally be in advance of. 2013 college finals, we had a very standard trapping four-person cup, and we're playing Central Florida, and their style of zone offense was to stand still and throw hammers. So having a set where we packed the crashing zone didn't make any sense. So we actually practiced before that game, when we got the trap on, dropping one of those players in the cup to add a third hammer to it. So then they didn't have as much hammer space and they couldn't do what they wanted to do. That's just one example of a thing that you can do to your zone to make sure it is fitting who you're up against. Again, I would encourage you to, if you're going to make a change like that, either know that it's going to take a point to adjust at least, or practice it in warm-ups. Don't expect that you can just say the way you want to do it and the players will necessarily be able to nail it on that first try. So yeah, that's kind of going into a game. I want to have a sense of how it's going to go, why we're playing zone against this team. So it could, just talking about like independent of weather conditions, just tactically, like this team has a phenomenal thrower, so we want to play more conservative when they have it, and maybe even change our zone so we're matching up against that player when they don't have the disc. That could be a little adjustment you make that's very opponent specific. But there should be direction and guidance when you go into the game of, this is why we're running zone. We think it's going to get us blocks against this team. This is why it's kind of like an upgrade over our person defense. And then that gives you a really good foundation to then make adjustments as you carry on, rather than your first adjustment having to be to what their their playing style is. But yeah, so I also think ideally you have a zone that you think is good against any team. There are some teams that we played zone against more because we thought it would be more effective, but you want to have a zone that you think can get blocks against any team and can be a thing in your arsenal that you're able to play, and then see if it works. You may have no idea how a team's going to respond to your zone defense, and I think it's always worth to just throw it in and see what happens. Maybe they'll crush it, and you will realize it's not really the day for it. But maybe a team will struggle against it in a way you don't expect, and you can't really predict until you actually see it happen. So those are the two ways I would approach at the onset of a game. Is we want to try our zone probably against every team because we're confident in it, and we want to see how the teams react. And then secondly, there might be something about the specific opponent that makes them more vulnerable to zone. And then you can have other things crop up, like during a game. Obviously, wind conditions are really important. Like the direction of the wind might influence if you go heavily trapping in one direction or not, or you might want to only run zone against a team when they're going downwind or when they're going upwind. Those obviously can creep up, or if it's very windy, you can be more aggressive with your hammers pinching, encouraging them to throw very long throws in bad wind. So those are little adjustments that you can have a sense of beforehand and like move into them and kind of expect that to happen. Another really good time to make a more in the moment decision of when to play zone, it's just what the game flow is. Dig against us in pool play is a really phenomenal example where it was last game of pool play. You could just tell they were very, very tired. The first point, our O-line scored pretty easily. Our D-line got 5 turnovers, didn't score, but it all had the feeling of, this is a game we're about to crush. they're exhausted, we're really deep and fresh. And then they ran a zone that not only shook our O-line out of their element, but it also gave their O-line players time to rest and then get their legs under them, and then they took half on us. And I think we beat them on, we beat them on Universe. So it was required a big comeback. But that's like a very distinct thing where, oh, things aren't going very well for us. We need something to change it up. In addition to also, our O-line is tired. That is a specific problem. Playing zone defense and points that last longer is a specific thing we can do to help that and let us become more stable. The other big reason to play zone is, again, that change of pace, is to keep the offense guessing. I personally don't put as much stock into that as I think a lot of other people do. But I guess I'm open to that being the truth. But to me, it seems like a platitude that's been passed down. If there was like a large scale statistical analysis of, if you play zone, the next person point, you're 10% more likely to get a turn, that would be cool. I don't know if that's the truth or not. So I'm less in the camp of zone makes the next person point easier. But it can be good to keep a team guessing, or you're up against an opponent that's like really, really fast and has a speed advantage, and you want to neutralize that from them. Those are kind of a lot of the things that you can make during a game where things aren't going in the direction you want them to go. Then throw a zone and see what you can do. So yeah, that is it about my thoughts on that and kind of how you implement in the game and how you make adjustments during a game. Does anyone have any questions about either that, or just really any questions about it in general? It is 8, so we should probably end relatively soon. But yeah, I'll give a minute or two for questions. And while I'm waiting for questions, I can say donate to Pittsburgh Ultimate. This is obviously a fundraiser. I'm not taking any money from this, so it's all going towards them. I'm sure a lot of us have been helped and affected by CPU in a lot of good ways. For me personally, I was given many opportunities to trial and error how I am as a coach and a human being, and I'm extremely grateful for Pittsburgh for giving that opportunity. I know I wouldn't be in Seattle coaching sockeye any way, shape, or form if I wasn't given the opportunities that I could in Pittsburgh. So if you have the money, please donate. They obviously need it. And yeah, thanks for hosting this. I think that looks like no more questions. So I'll hang on for another minute or two in case any questions pop up. Gregory Thomas, to sum up, would you say implementing zone in a game is predominantly lost the word. Is predominantly a situational decision? I would not. But that also depends on how good your zone becomes. For most of my coaching career, it has been situational. For the past season and maybe a little bit in 2018, but especially 2019, it was a defense that could stand on its own in any condition and still win. So I think that's what you want to aspire to have it as a defense that you can play in any condition. And hearkening back to the idea of remaining in your zone defense for full field, Buzz Bullets will pull to midfield because they're shorter than American teams and they don't have to guard the deep space as much. Like that can be a thought with your zone, where maybe you struggle against a longer field, but you have the ability to play it against a shorter field in a more compressed area. I think it can still be something that is successful regardless of condition. If it's not, be honest with your team and play in the situations it's an advantage. But I think you want to go with the goal that it can stand on its own and it doesn't need these advantageous things moving in your direction. Thoughts about youth learning zone versus hammering down person defensive skills first. That's really difficult, and something I have less experience with. It stinks because I've definitely seen so many zone situations where the opposing offense like just doesn't have any idea how to play zone offense, and it just becomes a pretty unwatchable sport. And you're wondering if you're actually teaching them things. I would say if you're teaching youth zone, make sure you're doing it in a way that is developing skills of communication, improvisation, spontaneity, field vision, and agency. And these skills can then translate into your person defense. Because you will be able to play a style of person defense that is more advanced and more holistic if you have these skills. But if you're playing a zone where it's just kind of like the common errors I talked about, everyone's disc watching, you're in a position, you're not picking up players, I think you're doing a disservice to the players because they're not really learning a lot in those situations. They're standing in a space, they're moving a little bit, and they're waiting for the offense to mess up. And I don't think that's great. But I think it also, it depends on what your context is and how good the opposing offenses are in your league. But I think as a youth coach, your primary goal should be to develop skills and set up your players for the long run, not to win games. So I would say if you're doing it in a way that teaches them things, great. If you're doing it in a way that wins your league because the other teams have no idea how to play zone offense, I don't think that's helping anybody. But yeah. I'll give another minute for questions, and that might be it. All right, I think that's it then. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Give money to CPU. Spend quarantine time meditating. That's all the advice that I have for now. So it was good to see a lot of names on screens of people I haven't seen in years. So thanks, Pittsburgh, for coming out in droves. And I've already forgotten who had that picture of friendship or that video of friendship, but it was nice to see Pittsburgh neighborhood again. So hope you're all doing well. Enjoy the rest of your night. And yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone, for coming.